invite Dr. Rokia Raslan. So Rokia is the Vice Dean for Innovation Enterprise at the Bartlett Faculty of the Built Environment and an Associate Professor in Building Performance Simulation at UCL IB. And we're now going to move from the non-domestic commercial sector to how to decarbonize homes. Happy to do.
Thank you so much, Hannah. Thank you all so much for coming in today. I moved over to researching the domestic sector from the non-domestic sector in 2010 with a focus on retrofit. And since 2019 or 18, I've been specifically focusing or trying to build research and sort of industry collaborations in the area of how to decarbonize homes specifically. So those homes that are trickier than most. So today I'll just give a brief overview of sort of the whole problem and then aim to answer 3 questions. The first is, what is a hard to decarbonize home? And the second is, who lives in them and why we need to tackle them? And the third question I'll try to answer or contribute to is, how can we retrofit these homes as part of the net zero transition? So in terms of the context, we all know that the UK is embarking on an ambitious green economic recovery, and this will see substantial investment in various sectors, in energy efficiency, and in particular in the retrofit of buildings to support the transition. But there's always been sort of a historical disconnect between efforts to retrofit or decarbonize and more challenging sectors of the built environment, ones that are not particularly straightforward. But as the net zero transition is becoming more and more entwined with social equity and energy equity, this disconnect is no longer an option. And this presentation focuses on a sector where there's been that historical disconnect, hard to decarbonize homes. Traditionally, when we hear the term hard to decarbonize in the field of energy research, we think about energy intensive and high carbon emitting sectors such as chemical industries, steel and aviation. But now it's been associated with the homes that we live in, and it's quite a serious term to be using. And what kind of unites both of these areas is a common problem. They're quite disparate, but they have a common problem. And that is reducing carbon emissions within these different sectors is not straightforward for 2 reasons. The first is we don't have the solutions currently available, or we do have the solutions, but they're cost prohibitive. They're really, really expensive. And when we talk about sort of the building sector, it's a fact that the near full decarbonisation of heat in buildings will be necessary if we are to meet net zero targets. And all homes will need to be fully decarbonised by 2050 to meet that kind of time target. But we kind of do not know how we're going to achieve this for about a quarter of the homes that we have in this country or around the world, let's say that. And that sector is the hard to treat or the hard to decarbonise subset of the residential stock. So what exactly am I talking about? What are these hard to treat or hard to decarbonise homes if you're not familiar with them? In general, the definition I like to use is that a home can be considered hard to decarbonise if it is hard to treat, or we do not have cost-effective options for low carbon heating. And that's because these homes usually have one or more physical, locational, occupant-related characteristics that mean that the effort to decarbonise them is faced with costs that are higher, barriers that are more difficult to overcome, or solutions that are more complex to implement. And when I say solutions, I mean decarbonisation solution, and that encompasses measures that improve energy efficiency, such as insulation, ones that motivate better use of energy with occupants, such as control or behavioural strategies, but also low carbon heating and, between brackets, cooling technology options. And back to the characteristics that might make a home hard to decarbonise. The first we like to think about is a set of characteristics which are associated with what we refer to as the physical form of the building. So its area, height and fabric. And the second set of characteristics often relate to where a building is sited. And that includes if a building is sited in an area with high exposure, or in a city where you have accessibility limitations, or even in conservation areas where you might be limited in terms of what you can do in terms of retrofitting those buildings. And the third set, and that one's kind of a bit new, is the occupants who live in these homes might have certain socioeconomic and behavioural characteristics and habits and constraints that might be sort of a barrier to retrofitting or decarbonising these homes, or a challenge. And they're not the hard to decarbonise homes aren't a challenge that's unique to one country or just in the UK, they exist everywhere. We reckon, sort of back of the envelope calculations, that about 1 in 4 homes around the world have some of these traits which I went through. In the UK, we're quite well informed in terms of how many of these homes we have, because CCC commissioned analysis, which UCL was part of, and as a conservative estimate, we can roughly assume that about 20% of our homes have these characteristics. On a regional scale, because a lot of you in industry won't just be focusing on the UK, another quick calculation we did in terms of the European context, where there's less information and less systematic research in the area than the UK, is that if you look at high-rise buildings, off-grid rural buildings and heritage buildings alone, they make up about 25% of properties across the EU, about 5 million homes. And even if you look at global scales and in economies where the construction rate has been quite high in the last few years, for example, in China, about 35% of homes in China are insulated in high-rise blocks. So ones that were built just before regulations came in to require that they be insulated. So in terms of a global market, we're talking about quite a significant problem. And the term hard to decarbonise has roots in various areas. There's lots of different terms that are floating around that have been used to describe these homes. The more common in the building sector is hard to treat, which focuses more on physical constraints, some mention of cost effectiveness and some discussion of off-grid properties, but mainly about the problems to do with the building fabric that have presented problems for retrofit. More recently, there's been sort of definitions that describe these homes as hard to treat, hard to heat. And that sort of definition links sort of the difficulty in decarbonisation with the impact on the occupants, them being fuel poor or finding it uncomfortable. And more recently, we've been using the term hard to decarbonise. And I'll explain why we've kind of shifted slightly towards this, and we might need to even revise that definition. But what's important is there are many various definitions. They differ in terms of the focus, the scope of what they consider to be constraints, the onus of responsibility as to who is responsible for this and who has to address it, and also the goal. What do we want to achieve with these homes? And I did mention that the term hard to treat was more common in the building sector, so it's been historically used. It focuses mostly on constraints, physical constraints and difficulties in applying different measures to these buildings. And later definitions have looked at cost effectiveness. We're kind of changing our perspective on that definition because it's somewhat slightly less holistic. And we're kind of using the CCC definition of hard to decarbonise as a starting point because we believe it describes the problem more holistically, considers both the constraints which I mentioned and also cost effectiveness. It aligns the debate with other sectors. So it's great for people from the built environment to be sitting around the table with policymakers from other sectors and to be able to speak the same language. But importantly, it acknowledges the role of occupants and owners in the problem. But of course, there are concerns on the fact that regarding the fact that the term decarbonise might mean that the end point is just reducing carbon emissions without looking at other aspects connected to health and well-being of occupants. Regardless of what definition we use, it's important to acknowledge that going forward, any definition we will use will have to capture the diversity of these homes. So these are examples of homes from the UK which might be considered hard to decarbonise. This includes rural properties in Wales, a tiny constrained home here in London where it's hard to install a heat pump, buildings in conservation areas where you have certain rules that you have to deal with, high-rise blocks where you've got split incentives, multi-tenancy. One of my colleagues here at UCL has described the problem of retrofitting these homes as a wicked problem. You also have less common homes such as National Trust properties and heritage properties. Tenements in Glasgow are also a major type of hard to decarbonise homes. They are very diverse. They are dispersed, so they're all around the UK and around the world, but they all share a common trait, which is they're disadvantaged by or have been historically disadvantaged so far by the efforts to decarbonise them. So who lives in these homes and why do we need to tackle them? Well, many of us actually do, and I for one live in a home that is hard to decarbonise. But generally, the lowest income, most vulnerable households disproportionately occupy these homes. Living in a hard to decarbonise homes makes fuel poverty more likely. So that's a very important aspect to think about. And as the least desirable stock, because they're expensive to heat or they're uncomfortable to live in, the fuel poor are more likely to end up in them. So people with resources are likely to opt out of living in these homes if possible. But there are other types of occupants who choose to live in homes such as this. So historic properties, rural properties, some people like it. So they live in homes that are not energy efficient, but they are not theoretically fuel poor. They are important from a carbon point of view, but they may not be the priority right now, as we're in an environment where fuel prices are such a big issue. And just to focus in on fuel poverty, so who are the fuel poor and how do they tie into this sector? My colleagues at Sheffield Hallam have come up with some really interesting statistics. About 3.5 million households in the UK are in fuel poverty, so low income, low energy efficiency home, and about 600k or 600,000 people were added to this figure due to COVID. Of these 3.5 million homes, 60% live in homes which have an EPC rating of A, E to G. And we don't know all of the reasons why a home is rated E to G, but we can assume that a lot of them are either hard to decarbonise or have owners who can't or won't improve them. 38% of people in fuel poverty live in the private rental sector, where the worst energy efficiency is concentrated, so that's very important for that sector, and where occupants have little or no influence on what happens in terms of energy efficiency in their homes. In terms of older properties, 18% of people who live, who are in fuel poverty live in pre-1919 homes, so that's sort of the oldest segment of the stock, and over 50% in pre-1944. So given all these problems, why should we tackle these homes? I believe it's an issue of societal equity. People have to have equal access to the benefits of the net zero transition. But also, it's an issue that if not addressed, will lead into a lock-in of climate and energy inequities and injustices. We won't reach our targets if we don't address these homes. And from a real estate perspective, these homes are very much at risk of asset stranding. They'll become redundant, they'll become obsolete when they become too expensive to heat, and they'll be unappealing. And I've heard anecdotally from social housing providers who do have hard to decarbonise homes within their stock that they're thinking of selling them off or just leaving them because they're just too expensive to deal with at this moment. So that's a big societal issue because you'll be losing a lot of social housing stock as a result. And we saw headlines such as this during the pandemic, and I'm sure we're seeing much more these days with the fuel crisis. And if we don't do anything about these homes, we'll continue seeing even worse headlines, I think, going forward. And if you look at these figures, £760 and £605 for gas, they seem quite reasonable given that what we pay these days. Another reason they should be tackled is the fact that there are strong indications that they are expected to be a growing area of policy focus in the near term. They were first mentioned in the fifth carbon budget quite a few years ago as an area where options to reduce carbon emissions were more difficult. And then the Committee on Climate Change continued their work in this field in their Net Zero 2050 report, where they were identified as an area of further ambition that was needed if we were to go beyond an 80% reduction target. More recently, government policy has started to talk about them, but there are some caveats there. So the Energy White Paper and the Clean Growth Strategy have mentioned that all homes should be upgraded to an EPCC by 2030. But the caveat is that they have to be practical, cost-effective, and affordable. So that cost-effectiveness issue has been there. And I've also said all fuel poor households and as many rented homes as possible are required to reach the same target by 2030. And in the heat and building strategy, the main kind of sentence of interest there is that they want to ensure that no home is left behind. But again, they add a caveat where it has to be cost effective. So government policy is moving in this area, they're funding research in this area, but that caveat of cost effectiveness is a bit concerning. So how can we retrofit these homes? One of the biggest instruments that we do have is large-scale programs, such as the ECO, which has seen many retrofits rolled out within the UK. In particular, the zero component as well, which to some extent targeted some of these hard to decarbonise homes. But as you can see, the numbers there aren't really up to the ambition that we need to be at in terms of meeting our targets generally, and the scope of these programs has kind of neglected these homes. There are several schemes which are currently happening now that do have components that do address hard to decarbonise homes. So the local area development fund, the home upgrade grant includes some elements which look at rural properties, and the social housing development fund does have elements which may address some typologies, but they're not, I don't think they're sufficient right now. And whatever scheme is developed or is put in place has to contend with a lot of considerations and barriers associated with these homes that I've mentioned. Some of them are around sort of heritage status of the building and planning and heritage constraints. Fire safety concerns is a very big one, which has been dominating the housing sector and the retrofit sector for some time. Cost will always remain a big element, competing priorities of different stakeholders, sectors across sort of the demographic distribution who are referred to as hard to reach occupants and landlords. Older homes, ones with bespoke construction and ones where structural concerns have to be addressed before you actually put in any energy efficiency measures. But also homes with external and internal space constraints, which are proving to be quite problematic for that rollout of heat pumps kind of headline that the government is supporting. So we've come up with 4 main aspects that should be considered as part of a holistic retrofit approach to these homes. Of course, we believe that retrofit in general has to be something that is well integrated. It has to look at finance, policy and regulations. It should have the knowledge base to support decision making. It should consider people, look at solutions and technologies, and consider the unintended consequences that might happen and try to mitigate them. To that, we like to add 4 different aspects that should be considered for hard to decarbonise homes. The one is the use of innovative technologies. We have to have a drive to innovate in the building sector to come up with solutions that are more suited to these homes and improve outcomes for these homes. And we believe that the technology push will lead to solutions that will trickle down across the sector. We think that scaling up approaches should be a fundamental element. And we think that data-driven approaches should be there to inform decision-making. And we think that any strategy should really be occupant-centric. They should include improved occupant engagement, but also include various stakeholders as well. In terms of innovation, I've just got some notes. I was looking at the SHDF documentation, and they do say that innovation is a big part. So that's good that it's being recognised as a main element going forward. At the core of SHDF is the requirement that successful delivery is supported by a steep learning curve. And it might be a major enabling programme because it requires industry to learn lessons and catalyse innovation in retrofitting and to demonstrate innovative approaches to retrofitting social housing at scale using whole house approaches. So in theory, some good movement on that front. In terms of scaling up, just as a caveat, I do recognise, we all recognise that no single delivery model can serve all the different types of dwellings in the UK well. But we have seen evidence of some case studies that we've seen as part of a research project we're looking at for BASE, looking at hard to decarbonise homes, that different scaling up approaches might offer that key element of enabling better cost effectiveness of things that might be a little bit more expensive than we're used to. And in terms of data-driven approaches, this is an area where research can really play a major role. Existing research on housing sector has mostly focused on housing types which have standard characteristics, so don't really have a lot of barriers. And I'm not saying all research, but the majority of research out there. And so far, studies into options for hard to decarbonize homes, including ones I've been involved with myself, have been technology centric. So they just looked at technologies and rollouts. And they've been very optimistic. So we've always assumed that existing and emerging options in terms of innovative technologies can be widely installed, would be widely accepted, and would perform largely as expected as well. And we know that is not the case. So we need data to inform the planning and design of retrofit. So we need new models which represent these homes at stock level better. We need to develop archetypes which are reflective of the characteristics. There are some, but they're quite limited. And we need to look at developing occupant personas to help people who are modeling occupant behavior as well, focusing on how people who live in these homes might behave in ways that are different from a normal occupant. And we need research to also support implementation. So testing of retrofits that have been rolled out in these homes and feedback as well to improve learning outcomes. And finally, we need to regard strategies that are more occupant-centric, ones that look at the roles of other actors in the agency in the process of coming up with better solutions. So including people, users, various stakeholders in developing solutions. R&D has always been a little bit disconnected from sort of market users. And also moving down from top-down policies towards more occupant engagement. So we will always have government schemes, but they should be really informed by what people need, want, and how they use these homes. And also looking at occupants who already live in these homes as a potential source of socio-technical innovation learning. So they might have developed some coping mechanisms which might inform how we want to develop new technologies going forward. And this might also look at consumers and different trigger points for where you introduce retrofit into their homes. This is a common thing in retrofit, but I think it's especially important for homes that are hard to decarbonize. And this is my final slide. I'll just leave it here to show you the difference between, these are homes pretty much within the same neighborhood in Bristol. And you can see from the thermal imaging there, one that's been largely retrofitted versus one of these homes that are hard to decarbonize. You can see the difference in terms of the fabric plots between both. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Rokia. And I guess we're used to think about how to decarbonize homes in the context of the building fabric characteristics, but it's really important to have the occupant-centric approaches as well. So one question for Rokia, if there is a burning question, one up there.
This is so wonderful to see your summary, and clearly, you know, the question on the sector, everybody in the sector is, you know, is the social housing retrofit plan working, and is it implementing the principles that you have outlined in your presentation, and are you wondering to what extent are you following the success and less successful stories from there?
Thank you so much, Judith. So we haven't specifically looked at analysing the outcomes of SHDF because it's a little bit early in the process, and because of COVID, I think things have been kind of slow in progressing. However, I know that there is increased interest in trying to implement this. And I think in mid-April, I'm doing a masterclass for people involved in the delivery of SHDF on hard to decarbonise homes, because there is a recognition that they are a problem and they can't afford to kind of keep pushing them further down the line. So there is increased interest. We don't yet have evidence of it being successful. We hope it will be.
Thank you. And people can ask more questions during the panel session.